They celebrate my funeral below. They must never know the truth. For the child, I must be strong. I will survive this. Reginald, my love.
Charlotte, you are my everything.
And you, my heart.
I will always protect you.
I know, my love.
Charlotte, you will not defy this family's traditions.
I cannot be silent, Agatha. You risk everything, heed my warning.
And if I refuse, you will be cast out, utterly alone.
Then so be it. I will not be a prisoner in my own home. They will regret locking me away. My dearest sister, I am trapped. Help me expose their lies. I choose to fight.
What would you do if the man who once promised to protect you handed your whole future to another woman and asked you to smile while he did it? Ashford Hall, autumn of 1870. Duke Edmund Holloway sat at the head of his own dinner table and asked his wife, Duchess Eleanor, to remove her mother's garnet and pearl set so that Miss Vivian Ashcombe could wear it to the county assembly the following week. He did not ask this quietly. He asked it in front of the footman, in front of the housekeeper, in front of his own son. Eleanor set down her fork. She unclasped the necklace herself, laid it in her husband's open palm, and said nothing at all. The footman exchanged a glance. The housekeeper found something urgent to attend to in the hallway. Edmund smiled, satisfied, certain that her silence meant surrender. He had no way of knowing that his wife's silence was not surrender. It was the sound of a woman closing a door on one life and quietly opening another. Greetings. Gentle viewers, welcome back to the halls of Ashford. If you are new here, you are stepping into a story of a duke who mistook kindness for weakness, and a duchess who let him believe it, right up until the moment it cost him everything he had. The room Charlotte had been given faced away from the drive, which meant she could not see carriages arrive and could not be seen arriving in return. She had worked this out on her first night there, standing at the window and understanding, slowly, that the choice of room had not been an accident. Nothing in this house was an accident. She had learned that much. She spent her mornings reading the same books she had brought from her father's shelves, worn soft at the corners from her mother's hands before hers. Property law. Inheritance law. The kind of reading most wives were never encouraged toward, because most husbands preferred wives who did not know precisely how little the law protected them. Charlotte had grown up knowing exactly how little it protected them. Her mother had made certain of that, in the years before she died, sitting with young Charlotte at the kitchen table and going through case after case the way other mothers taught embroidery stitches. A woman's silence is not the same as her consent, her mother used to say. Remember the difference, even when no one else will. Charlotte remembered it now, in a locked room, 6 months married and already learning what her silence had been mistaken for. The room itself had become a kind of second education. She knew every crack in the plaster ceiling, every place the floorboards complained under her weight, every hour the light moved across the far wall and told her, without a clock, how much of the day remained to be survived. She had arranged her small collection of books along the windowsill in the order she meant to read them again, because reading them once had not been enough to make the hours pass, and she suspected, correctly, that she would need to read them many times more before this was finished. In the beginning, she had allowed herself to grieve the marriage she thought she was entering. She no longer had the patience for grief. Grief was a luxury for women who still had time to spend on feelings that changed nothing, and Charlotte had begun to understand, somewhere in the second month of her confinement, that she did not have time to spend carelessly anymore. Not with what she now knew was growing inside her. She thought, some mornings, of the version of herself who had arrived at Ashmoor Hall in a wedding gown, certain that a title and a handsome husband amounted to safety. That version of herself felt like a stranger now, someone she had outgrown the way a child outgrows a favorite coat, not with resentment, exactly, but with a clear understanding that the coat no longer fit and never would again. Effie arrived with the breakfast tray a little after 8, glancing back toward the stairs before she came fully into the room. "They've started decorating the ballroom," Effie said, setting the tray down. "Flowers arriving all morning. His Grace wants white roses everywhere, if you can believe the expense of it. For the Jubilee Ball, and for an announcement too, if the housekeeper's to be believed. Something His Grace means to make in front of everyone." Charlotte set down her book carefully, the way she had learned to set everything down carefully in this house, so that nothing of what she felt could be read in how hard she gripped it. "Does the housekeeper say what sort of announcement?" "She wouldn't say plain. But Miss Castellane's dressmaker has been to the house twice this week." Effie's eyes flicked to Charlotte's face and softened. "I'm sorry, Your Grace. I shouldn't have said that." "You should always say," Charlotte told her. "I would rather know a hard thing than be comfortable in a lie." It was, she realized as she said it, the truest thing she had told anyone in months. That afternoon, alone again, Charlotte allowed herself something she rarely permitted. She pressed a hand flat against her stomach and simply sat with the knowledge of what was there. 10 weeks now, by her count. 10 weeks of a secret so large it had begun to feel like the only solid thing in a house built entirely out of appearances. She thought of Reginald downstairs, ordering roses for another woman. She thought of Agatha, who visited once a week to inquire, in that same soft, unhurried voice, whether Charlotte's constitution had improved. It had not improved. It had never been unwell to begin with. But Charlotte had stopped correcting her weeks ago, because she had come to understand something important. A woman thought delicate is watched less closely than a woman thought dangerous. Let them think her delicate a little longer. She had work to do first. That night, after Effie had come and gone with the supper tray and the house below had gone quiet, Charlotte lit a single candle and sat at the small writing desk pushed into the corner of her room, a desk no one had thought to remove, because no one had imagined she would need it for anything more than letters to relatives she was no longer permitted to see. She began a list. Not of grievances, though the grievances would have filled pages on their own, but of facts. What she knew of Reginald's finances, gathered in scraps over 6 months of half-heard conversations through doors that did not quite close. What she knew of Agatha's habits, the day she visited the solicitor's offices in the village, the letters she wrote and burned rather than posted. What she knew of the household staff, which of them watched her with pity and which watched her with the particular blankness of people who had decided not to see anything at all. It was slow work and lonely work, and more than once she set the pen down and pressed both hands against her stomach instead, as if she could explain to the small, unseen thing growing there exactly what kind of house it had been born into, and why its mother intended to change that before it arrived. She did not cry. She had promised herself, somewhere around the 4th week of the locked door, that she would allow herself exactly one true collapse and no more one night to feel the full weight of what had been done to her, and she had already spent that night, alone, in the dark, in the first week of her confinement. She did not intend to spend another. Tears solved nothing in this house. Only facts did, carefully gathered and carefully used. By the time the candle burned low, her list had grown to 3 full pages, and something that had felt, for weeks, like grief slowly settled, instead, into resolve. 3 floors down, in a drawing-room full of afternoon light, Reginald Wren stood beside Vivienne Castellane and allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, to feel entirely at ease. "You're certain your mother approves of all this?" Vivienne said, turning a glass of sherry slowly in her hand. "She has looked at me exactly twice since I arrived, and both times as though I'd tracked mud onto her floors." "My mother approves of what's useful," Reginald said. "As for my wife, she understands her situation. She has understood it for weeks." Vivienne did not entirely believe that a woman could understand being replaced and simply accept it, but she had learned not to press Reginald on subjects that made his jaw tighten, so she let it pass, the way she had let a dozen other uncomfortable things pass since the season began. Agatha entered without knocking, as was her habit, and surveyed the room the way a general surveys ground before a battle. "The florist requires an answer on the roses by tomorrow," she said. "And I trust you have thought carefully about the wording of your announcement, Reginald. An announcement without documents behind it is only gossip. A declaration with an annulment already filed is a fact no one can argue with. I intend to declare an intention, Mother, and the papers will be ready before the ball." Reginald settled back into his chair with the easy contentment of someone who had never once had to fight for anything he wanted. He had married Charlotte because his mother had arranged it, and he had married her without particular objection because she was pleasant enough to look at and clever enough not to embarrass him at dinner parties. It had not occurred to him, in the 6 months since, to wonder what she wanted, because it had genuinely never occurred to him that a wife's wanting was a category of thing worth considering. His father had run this house the same way, and his father before him, and Reginald had never seen any evidence that the arrangement caused anyone real harm. He believed, sincerely, that Charlotte's removal to the East Wing had been an act of mercy rather than punishment, a quiet place for a wife who had disappointed the family to wait out her disappointment without an audience. He did not think of it as cruelty. He rarely thought of Charlotte at all, in fact, except as a problem his mother was managing on his behalf. The way she managed the tenant disputes and the household accounts and every other unpleasant detail he preferred not to trouble himself with. Vivienne's glass paused halfway to her lips at the word annulment, but Agatha waved the question away before it could fully form, in the tone she used for anyone she considered temporary. "The particulars," she said, "were a family matter, and none of Vivienne's concern." It was, in fact, exactly the kind of matter Agatha had spent 30 years learning to handle without help from anyone. She had married into this family herself, once, a girl from a smaller house with a bloodline nobody had bothered to investigate closely, and she had spent every year since making certain no one investigated her son's marriage closely either. Charlotte's family tree had been quietly reviewed the week the engagement was announced. Agatha had found what she expected to find: nothing remarkable, nothing dangerous, a modest family with modest connections. She had been wrong. She simply did not know it yet. The papers, Reginald mentioned, were already being drawn up by the junior partner at Whitcomb's firm, the senior man being away in London until autumn. Agatha's mouth tightened faintly at the thought that she would have preferred the senior man's experience on something this delicate, but she said nothing further, filing the thought away, the way she filed away everything, for later use if later use became necessary. That evening, the household gathered for dinner without Charlotte, who took her meals upstairs now as a matter of routine no one questioned anymore. Reginald raised a glass to a room full of guests invited for a preliminary supper before the larger event to come, and toasted, with real warmth in his voice, to new beginnings. Upstairs, Charlotte heard the toast through the floorboards, muffled but unmistakable, and understood exactly what kind of beginning he meant. She did not weep at the sound of it, though she noticed, with some detachment, that a version of herself from a year ago certainly would have. Instead she thought of her list, folded now into the lining of a book Effie had smuggled up, and found a strange, cold comfort in the fact that Reginald's confidence downstairs and her own quiet work upstairs were, in their way, mirror images of each other, both of them certain, both of them building toward an announcement, and only one of them correct about how the evening would end. In the servants' hall below, the mood was less celebratory than the drawing-room above it. The staff of Ashmoor Hall had watched the Duchess arrive as a bride full of careful kindness toward everyone from the housekeeper to the stable boys, and they had watched, over 6 months, Her meals grow smaller in portion by no fault of her appetite. Her requests for company grow fewer. Her room grow colder in a house that could easily afford more coal. Servants talk, in the particular hushed shorthand of people who depend on a household for their livelihood and therefore cannot afford to talk too loudly. But they talk. Effie was not the only one among them who had begun, quietly, to take the Duchess's side. The housekeeper, Mrs. Price, had started sending up slightly larger portions than the official instructions allowed, trusting that no one counted closely enough to notice. The old groundskeeper, who had known Charlotte's father years before in a different county entirely, had taken to leaving fresh flowers where Effie could easily carry them upstairs, saying nothing about why. None of them could do much. All of them, in their small ways, had decided not to do anything. It was this quiet current of loyalty, more than any single dramatic act, that would carry Charlotte through the weeks that followed, proof that a house built on one family's cruelty could still hold, within its walls, people who had simply decided, without being asked, to be kind. It was Effie who brought the box. She arrived earlier than usual one morning, breathless, having taken the back stairs at a pace that left her flushed. "The old nursery's being cleared for storage," she said. "Mrs. Price found this at the back of a wardrobe and didn't know what to do with it, so she gave it to me to burn with the rest of the rubbish. I couldn't." The box was small, wooden, its corners worn pale. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed handkerchief, was a locket Charlotte did not recognize, and beneath it, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon gone brittle with age. "Whose is it?" Charlotte asked, though something in her chest had already begun to answer before Effie could. "There's a name on the letters. Fairweather." Charlotte went very still. Fairweather had been her mother's maiden name. She opened the locket first. Inside was a miniature portrait of a young woman with Charlotte's own dark hair and Charlotte's own steady eyes, dressed in clothing at least 40 years out of fashion, wearing a small crest at her collar that Charlotte had never seen before and somehow still recognized, the way one recognizes a word in a language never formally taught. The letters took the rest of the morning to read. They were written in a careful hand to someone named only Cousin, and they spoke, in the guarded language of people who knew their words might be read by the wrong eyes, of a family forced from a small kingdom across the water when its royal line was overthrown, of a single surviving daughter smuggled into England under a different name, married quietly into obscurity to keep her safe, her bloodline recorded nowhere but in letters exactly like these. Charlotte read the last letter 3 times before she understood what it meant. Her mother's mother had been that daughter, which meant Charlotte was not merely married into a family holding a throne in trust. She was the very bloodline that trust had been waiting 200 years to find. She sat with that knowledge for a long time, the locket cold in her palm, and felt something shift inside her that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but close cousin to both. She thought of Alden the way most English readers thought of it, if they thought of it at all, a small kingdom on the maps in her father's old atlas, a footnote in the newspapers whenever its politics grew briefly interesting enough to report. She had never imagined it as anything more than geography. Now it sat in her chest like a second heartbeat, a place she had never seen and somehow still belonged to, waiting on the other side of letters written by people who had died before she was born. The letters described a palace she tried, and failed, to properly picture. They described a coup carried out over a single violent week, a royal family scattered across half of Europe in disguise, a single infant girl smuggled out beneath a nursemaid's cloak because she was too young to be recognized by the soldiers checking papers at the border. That infant had grown into the woman in the miniature portrait, Charlotte's grandmother, who had spent the rest of her life in England under a borrowed name, married to a modest country gentleman, raising a daughter who grew up believing her own mother was simply eccentric, private, given to strange silences whenever the subject of her own childhood arose. Charlotte's mother had likely known some version of the truth. Charlotte understood that now, turning the pieces over the way she once turned over a difficult passage of law until it finally made sense. The lessons at the kitchen table had not been random. Her mother had been preparing her, in whatever incomplete way she dared, for a life that might one day require exactly this kind of careful, patient thinking. "Your Grace," Effie asked, worried by the silence, "have I done wrong, bringing it?" "No," Charlotte said. "You may have done the only right thing anyone's done in this house in months." She thought of her mother at the kitchen table, teaching her law instead of embroidery. She had always assumed it was simply her mother's nature, a woman ahead of her time raising a daughter to match. Now she wondered if her mother had known, somewhere beneath the surface of things, that her daughter would one day need every piece of that knowledge simply to survive her own marriage. There was a new law now, 2 past a year before, still unfamiliar to most of the country. The Married Women's Property Act. Charlotte had read about it in the newspapers Effie smuggled up along with the breakfast tray, articles arguing over what it would mean for wives across England. Before it, anything Charlotte owned before her marriage had become her husband's the moment she said her vows. Under the new act, for the first time, a married woman could hold her own earnings and certain property in her own name, separate from her husband's control. It was not everything. It did not undo Reginald's power over her, or Agatha's, or the locked door at the top of the east stairs. But it was a foothold where there had been none before, and Charlotte had spent her whole life learning to build a case out of smaller foundations than that. "I need to see Mr. Whitcomb," she told Effie. "Not the senior partner. The younger one. Can it be arranged without her Grace or his Grace hearing of it?" Effie's mouth is set in a thin, determined line. "I'll see to it." The weeks that followed asked more discipline of Lillian Vance than any single year of her marriage had. By day she remained the Duchess, society expected hosting, smiling, growing visibly heavier with child, accepting the small kindnesses strangers offer a woman near her time. By evening, in a locked room adjoining her own chamber that Cassius had never once shown interest in entering, she worked through the folio of records Silas brought her, piece by piece, the way her father had once taught her to read a balance sheet for the lie hidden inside a column that added up correctly on its surface. The first task was simple and urgent: trust. Within a fortnight, working through her father's own solicitor rather than any man Cassius had ever met, Lillian moved the guardianship clause into an amended trust naming herself and a second, independent trustee as senior partner at the board of merchants who had known her father for 30 years and owed the Duke of Ashmoor nothing at all. The clause Silas had warned her of was closed before Cassius ever thought to look for it. "He will not find a way in," the old solicitor told her, as she signed the final page with a hand that did not shake. "Not through any court in England." "Good," Lillian said. "Let him keep believing he still has one." It was Thomas Bell, the young Bristol clerk, who brought them the piece of the puzzle Lillian had not known to look for. A letter had crossed his desk in error, addressed to Dr. Edmund Whitlow, a physician of some reputation in nervous disorders of women, requesting a private consultation regarding the health of the Duchess of Ashmoor following her confinement, and hinting, in language careful enough to protect the writer but plain enough for a man who already suspected the worst, that a formal certificate might be required within the month. Thomas Bell had copied the relevant lines before resealing the letter and sending it on its way, and had ridden 2 days to deliver the copy to Silas himself rather than trust it to the post. Lillian read the copy twice, seated at the small table in her locked room, and felt the last of her doubt about her husband's intentions settle into cold, unambiguous certainty. "He means to have it dated for after the birth," she said quietly, "while I am still weak from the confinement, and least able to argue against a physician's opinion." "So it appears, Your Grace," Silas said. "I am glad, now, that the trust is already closed." "So am I," Lillian said, and found that her hands, resting on the table, did not shake at all. She thought often, in the days that followed, of Thomas Bell, a young man she had never met and likely never would, risking a position he could ill afford to lose so that a duchess he had never spoken to might have the warning she needed. She asked Silas to see that a sum of money reached him quietly, through a channel that could never be traced back to Ashmoor House, not as payment, she was careful to specify, but as the simple acknowledgement owed to any honest man who had chosen, at real cost to himself, to do the right thing when the easier course lay open in front of him. It was a small gesture, set against everything else she was building that autumn, but it mattered to her more than most of the larger ones, a private reminder that whatever else this ordeal took from her, it would not take her father's habit of remembering who had earned her loyalty. The second task took longer, and required more of Silas than of her. 2 years of dismissal had not idled him. Working through Thomas Bell and 2 other contacts along the Bristol docks, Silas began reconstructing the true trail of the forged contracts the shares sold below value to a shell buyer that traced, through 3 careful layers, back to an account controlled by Cassius himself. He believed no one would ever look closely enough to follow it, Silas said, laying the reconstructed ledger across the small table in Lillian's locked room. "Your father built this house on the principle that every transaction should survive being looked at twice. The Duke never learned that lesson. He only learned how to look confident while he broke it." Lillian traced a column of figures with one finger, feeling the particular satisfaction of watching a lie collapse into an arithmetic she could actually prove. "How much has he taken?" "Enough that if it were repaid tomorrow, the house would still stand. Enough that if it is never repaid, and never exposed, your child will inherit a fortune quietly hollowed out from the inside." He watched her steadily. "Enough, Your Grace, that a board of merchants showing this evidence would have grounds to demand a full public audit, and a magistrate reason to issue a warrant, on the same afternoon." "Then we will give them both the evidence and the afternoon," Lillian said. "But not yet. He is still paying Mrs. Rourke's debts, which means he is not yet desperate enough to do something reckless. I would rather he grow comfortable a while longer. A comfortable man does not think to hide his tracks better. There was a third task, harder than the other two, that Lillian undertook herself, without Silas's help, because it required something he could not offer her, the particular currency of one wronged woman speaking honestly to another. She wrote to Adelia Rourke. Not a threat. Not an accusation dressed as a letter. She wrote, instead, a simple invitation to call at Ashmoor House privately, on an afternoon when the Duke was known to be at his club, and when Adelia arrived, wary and pale beneath her careful colour, Lillian did not raise her voice once. "I know what my husband has been doing with the Merrick accounts to settle your debts," Lillian said, pouring tea for a woman she had every reason to despise and finding, to her own surprise, that despising her required more energy than she wished to spend. "I do not believe you asked him to steal for you. I believe you asked him to help you, and he chose theft because it was easier than honesty, the same way he has chosen it with me for 8 years." Adelia's hands, around the teacup, were not steady. "What do you want from me, Your Grace?" "The truth, in writing, of where his money for you actually came from. And in return, when this is finished, I will see that your name survives it with far less damage than his will. You are not the one I intend to ruin, Mrs. Rourke. You are simply the one who happens to be standing closest to him when the ruin arrives." Adelia was quiet for a long moment, turning the cup in her hands without drinking from it. "He told me the money came from a family inheritance. I did not ask further. I think, if I am honest with you, I did not wish to know the answer badly enough to ask." "Few of us do, at first," Lillian said, more gently than she had intended. "I did not ask further either, for 8 years. It was not forgiveness." Lillian was careful, even in her own private accounting of the afternoon, never to call it that. It was, instead, the recognition that Cassius Vance had built his entire life on convincing women they had no better option than to trust him, and that the fastest way to dismantle that life was to show 2 of those women, at last, precisely how much better an option they had in each other. They sat a while longer after the letter was written, the tea gone cold between them, and Lillian found herself asking, almost against her own intention, whether Adelia had ever loved him, or only needed him. Adelia considered the question with more honesty than Lillian had expected from a woman she had known only as a rival. "I do not know that I can tell the difference any more, Your Grace," Adelia said quietly. "He is very good at making a woman believe the two are the same thing. I imagine you learned that a long time before I did." "I did," Lillian said. "I am only now learning how to tell them apart again." Adelia wrote the letter before she left the house that day. Lillian locked it away with the ledgers, and the trust, and the growing weight of evidence that would, within a matter of weeks, be more than enough. By the time autumn turned toward the date Cassius had already announced for his harvest gala, a grand evening meant to reassure investors and society alike that Ashmoor House stood as strong as ever. Lillian Vance was no longer a woman waiting to discover what her husband had done to her. She was a woman waiting, with great and terrible patience, for the correct evening to show him what she had done in return. Cassius announced the harvest gala with the particular confidence of a man who did not know he was already standing on ground that had been quietly hollowed out beneath him. "Rumors travel faster than facts in this city," he told Lillian one evening, pacing his study while she sat with her hands folded over the child that would, by every estimate, arrive within the month. "There has been foolish talk about the state of the Merrick accounts. I intend to put it to rest properly. Every investor of consequence in London will be under this roof, and every one of them will leave believing the house has never been stronger." "You have no idea how right you are," Lillian thought, watching him rehearse his own confidence in the reflection of the darkened window, and how differently that will read to you by the end of the evening. She had, in truth, allowed a careful thread of those rumors to circulate herself, through channels Cassius would never think to trace back to his own wife. A quiet word from the senior partner now serving as her second trustee, a mention over cards at the club Cassius favored, nothing so direct it could be traced, only enough to ensure her husband would respond exactly as he had, by gathering every important name in London into one room on one evening to prove himself innocent of a theft he had, in fact, committed. It was, she reflected, remarkably easy to manage a man who had spent 8 years teaching her precisely how his pride worked. The final arrangements consumed the days that followed. Sir Bertram Holt, the magistrate who had served under Edmund Merrick's patronage for 20 years before rising to his post, required more persuading than either the Board of Merchants or the Trust had, and only because he insisted, rightly, on seeing every document with his own eyes before he would agree to bring a warrant to a duke's front door. Lillian met him herself, at Silas's insistence that the case would carry more weight coming from the wronged Duchess than from any clerk, however honest. You understand, Your Grace, Sir Bertram said, turning the reconstructed ledger's pages with the slow care of a man who had learned long ago never to rush a document that might one day be read aloud in a courtroom, that once I have seen this, I cannot unsee it. There will be no quiet arrangement after tonight, no private settlement between families. If these figures hold, the law will take its course wherever that course leads, title or no title. I am not asking you to spare him, Sir Bertram, Lillian said. I am asking you to see the truth, and let it do what truth does. He studied her for a long moment, this heavily pregnant young Duchess sitting across from him with a composure he had rarely seen in men twice her age facing far smaller trials. Your father would be very proud of you tonight, Your Grace, whatever comes of it. It was the first time in weeks that Lillian's composure nearly failed her, and she was grateful, afterward, that it had not. There was, in those final weeks, one conversation she allowed herself that had nothing to do with ledgers or trusts or the careful architecture of a downfall. It was late, and the household was asleep, and Silas had stayed longer than usual reviewing the final account of the shell purchase with her at the small table in her locked room. When the work was finally done, he did not rise immediately to leave, and neither did she rise to see him out. You have built something remarkable these past weeks, Your Grace, he said quietly. Not the case against him. I mean the composure it has taken you to build it without once letting him see it in your face. I learned composure a long time before I learned the rest of this, Lillian said. 8 years is a great deal of practice at smiling through things I did not feel. I am sorry it was never a skill you needed. There was a warmth in the way he said it, careful and restrained. The warmth of a man who had watched her closely enough over the past weeks to see past the composure to what it cost her, and who had never once, in all that time, asked her for anything in return for his loyalty beyond the chance to see justice done. Lillian felt it land somewhere she had not expected, a small, quiet reminder that not every man who stood close to her was calculating what he could take. She found herself, in the candlelight of that small room, studying the steady grey of his eyes a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, and did not look away from it as quickly as perhaps she should have. When this is finished, she said, I hope you will still be willing to sit at a table with me and talk of something other than fraud. Your Grace, Silas said, with the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him yet, it would be my honor. Neither of them said more than that. It was not the moment for more. But Lillian carried the warmth of it with her up the stairs that night, a small, private proof that whatever Cassius had taken from her, he had not managed to take everything, and that somewhere in the long, careful architecture of her own survival, something unplanned and undeserved and entirely her own had quietly begun to grow. The final piece fell into place 3 days before the gala, when the Board of Merchants, presented with Silas's reconstructed ledgers and the traced shell account, agreed to send a delegation of auditors to Ashmoor House on the evening of the party itself, under the cover of an ordinary courtesy call to the Duke's new investors. Adelia Rourke's letter, sealed and addressed, sat ready in Silas's coat. And on the morning of the gala, Lillian Vance stood before her mirror while Nan fastened a gown of deep green silk at her back, and studied her own reflection with the calm of a woman who had spent 8 years learning to disappear behind a smile, and intended, that evening, to be seen at last exactly as she was. You are trembling, my lady, Nan said softly, steadying the last clasp. I am not afraid, Nan, Lillian said. I am simply ready. Ashmoor House had never looked more triumphant than it did that night, which was, Lillian understood as she descended the staircase on her husband's arm, precisely the point of triumph she intended to end. The ballroom below had been transformed for the season, great sheaves of wheat and trailing autumn ivy woven along the balustrades, tables dressed in gold and deep russet, a small orchestra tuning near the far wall beneath candlelight doubled and redoubled in the tall mirrors Cassius had commissioned 2 summers before, when the estate's fortunes had first begun to recover enough to afford such vanities. Every name of consequence in London filled the room investors Cassius had spent weeks courting, members of the Board of Merchants who bowed to Lillian with a particular deference she now understood was loyalty to her father rather than to the Duke, a cousin of minor royalty seated near the head table whose presence alone had cost Cassius 3 separate dinners of careful flattery to secure, and, near the center of the room in a gown of deep sapphire, Mrs. Adelia Rourke, present at Cassius' own invitation, unaware that the letter in her own hand now sat folded in Silas Hargrove's coat pocket across the room. Cassius was, that evening, magnificent in his confidence. He moved through his guests with easy charm, laughing at the right moments, reassuring the right investors with the right small, private smiles that suggested he trusted them with information he trusted no one else with. He raised a private toast early in the evening, before the seated supper began, to the health of his coming heir and the enduring strength of the house his marriage had rebuilt, and the room applauded him for it, and Lillian, standing at his side in her deep green silk, applauded along with them, and felt not one flicker of the old warmth she had once felt hearing him speak that way. He believes this is his evening, she thought, watching him move from table to table with his easy laugh and his practiced warmth. He has believed every evening for 8 years was his. Tonight he will finally learn how many of them were actually mine. She stood beside him through the first hour, heavily pregnant, radiant, the very picture of the devoted Duchess he had toasted only weeks before, and let him believe, until the very last possible moment, that this evening belonged entirely to him. It began, as she had arranged it to begin, during the first course of the seated supper. A footman crossed the room and bent to murmur something at the ear of the senior board partner seated near the head table. The man rose, unhurried, and made his way to where Cassius sat at the center of his own triumph. "Your Grace," he said, pitched just loud enough to carry to the nearest tables, exactly as intended, "I must apologize for the interruption, but a matter concerning the Merrick Trading House accounts requires your immediate attention. Our auditors have completed a review of the recent share transfers, and there are discrepancies I believe you will wish to address before this room finishes its supper rather than after." The laughter around the nearest tables faded into the particular silence of people who have just realized they are witnessing something they will describe to others for years. "I am certain this can wait until morning," Cassius said, his smile not moving an inch, though Lillian, closer to him than anyone else in the room, saw the fraction of a second where his hand tightened around his glass. "I am afraid it cannot, Your Grace. The transfers in question bear your signature authorizing the sale, and the Duchess's, though the Duchess assures me she signed no such document." Every eye at the table turned to Lillian. She let the silence hold a moment longer than necessary before she spoke. "I did not," she said quietly, and the two words carried further in that hushed room than any raised voice could have. Before Cassius could answer, a second interruption arrived, this one carried by the most notorious gossip columnist in London society, seated 3 tables away, who had that very hour received a sealed packet at her own place setting from a footman she did not recognize and would later be unable to describe. She had, being precisely the sort of woman she was, already opened it. "Your Grace," she said, rising with the packet in her gloved hand and a look of scandalized delight she did not bother to disguise. "Perhaps you would care to explain to the room why Mrs. Rourke's racing debts appear to have been settled, month after month, from funds drawn against the very trading shares your board partner is asking about." Whispers moved through the room the way fire moves through dry summer grass, quiet at first and then all at once. A dowager 2 tables distant leaned to murmur behind her fan to her neighbor. A young investor who had, only that afternoon, signed papers committing a considerable sum to the Duke's next venture, set down his glass with a hand that had gone suddenly unsteady. The orchestra, sensing without quite understanding that something had shifted in the room, faltered mid-phrase and did not resume. The room did not gasp. Not yet. It went instead into the particular stillness of 200 people simultaneously deciding it would be socially fatal to look away. Somewhere near the back wall, Lillian caught, for the briefest moment, the steady grey eyes of Silas Hargrove, watching not the spectacle unfolding at the head table but her, as though to make certain, before anything else happened, that she was ready for what came next. She held his gaze a half-second longer than necessary and felt something in her spine straighten further still. Adelia Rourke, 3 tables distant, went the color of the tablecloth. Cassius rose from his chair, and for the first time all evening the charm slipped fully from his face, replaced by something colder and more desperate. "This is a fabrication, a jealous rumor dressed up as evidence, and I will not stand here and be." The doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and Sir Bertram Holt entered in his magistrate's coat, 2 constables a respectful step behind him, and the room, this time, did gasp. "Duke of Ashmoor," Sir Bertram said, crossing the floor with the unhurried authority of a man who had waited a very long time to say these particular words to this particular family, "I have here a warrant, issued this afternoon on the sworn evidence of the Board of Merchants and the Trading House's own reconstructed accounts, charging you with fraud, forgery, and the unlawful dissipation of a trust estate. You will accompany my constables now." Cassius' gaze swept the room, the auditors, the columnist with her packet, Adelia frozen white-faced at her table, the magistrate advancing with 2 constables and finally landed on his wife, seated calm and upright and heavily pregnant at the head of the table he had built his entire performance around. "Lillian," he said, and his voice, for the first time in 8 years, had nothing rehearsed left in it. "What have you done?" "I have done," she said, rising slowly, one hand resting on the child beneath her heart, "exactly what you taught me to do, my lord. I looked at the numbers, I found where they did not add up, and I corrected them." The constables took him by each arm. He did not struggle. Whatever fight remained in him seemed to have gone out the moment he understood the room had already decided, in the space of a few minutes, exactly what it believed of him, and that no charm he still possessed would be enough to change its mind. As they led him toward the great doors, his eyes swept the crowd of guests once more, searching, Lillian thought, for a single sympathetic face among the 200 he had spent years cultivating, and finding none. Investors who had toasted his health an hour earlier now studied their own hands. The columnist was already writing. Even the cousin of minor royalty, whose presence Cassius had worked so hard to secure, had turned to murmur something to his companion that was plainly not sympathy. The room watched him go the way rooms watch a fire they are grateful is not their own, and in the long, ringing silence that followed the closing of the great doors behind him, Lillian Vance remained standing at the head of the table that had, for 8 years, belonged to another name than her own, and found that her hands, at last, were entirely steady. Somewhere behind her, she heard the orchestra leader, uncertain what else to do with 200 guests who had just watched a duke arrested over the fish course, quietly signal his musicians to begin again, and the strange, soft resumption of music beneath all that ruin struck her, in that moment, as the truest sound she had heard all evening, proof that the world simply continued, indifferent and steady, exactly as it always had, waiting only for her to decide what she meant to build inside it next. They allowed her, at her own quiet insistence, a private word with him before the carriage took him to await trial. He sat in the small anteroom off the entrance hall where he had once received tenants seeking favors, stripped now of the cream waistcoat and the watch chain, of every ornament that had ever made him look like a man in command of anything. Lillian stood in the doorway a long moment before she came fully inside, and set 2 documents on the table between them. "You should know the rest of it, before you go," she said, "since I do not imagine anyone in that room tonight told you the part that matters most to me." He did not answer. He simply watched her, waiting, the way a drowning man watches the shore. "I know about the letter you sent Dr. Whitlow 3 weeks ago," Lillian said, "requesting a certificate of nervous instability, to be dated after our child is born. I know it was meant to hand you guardianship, and with it, control of everything my father left in trust for our children. I closed that clause before you ever thought to open it. There is nothing left in that plan for you to reach for." Something moved behind his eyes. Not remorse, she understood, watching him carefully. Only the particular shock of a man discovering, all at once, that every advantage he believed he still held had already been quietly dismantled weeks before he ever needed it. "You knew," he said finally. "All of it. For weeks." "I knew enough," Lillian said, "to protect my child, and my father's house, and myself, without ever needing you to help me do it. That is the part one do not think you will ever fully understand, Cassius. You married me believing I was worth exactly as much as the fortune attached to my name. I have spent this month proving to you, and to myself, that I was never the smaller half of this marriage. I was only the half who had not yet learned to stop being kind to someone who never once deserved it." He opened his mouth, and closed it again, and for the second time that night, the Duke of Ashmoor found himself with nothing rehearsed to say. She did not wait for him to find something. She turned, gathered the documents from the table, and left him there in the small anteroom with only the sound of the constable's boots on the gravel outside to keep him company. The trial, when it came some weeks later, was brief. The evidence Silas had spent 2 patient years assembling left the court very little to deliberate over. Lillian did not attend more than the first morning of it, her time too near for the strain of a public courtroom, but Silas brought her a full account each evening, and Sir Bertram himself called at Ashmoor House the day the verdict was returned, out of what he called, with a rare small smile, professional courtesy to a duchess who had done half the magistrate's work for him. Cassius Vance, stripped of his title's influence though not, by law, of the title itself, was sentenced to a term that would keep him well away from London, from Ashmoor House, and from any further claim on either his daughter or the Merrick fortune, for a great many years to come. Marguerite Vance was born 11 days after the gala, on a bright, ordinary morning, with a full head of dark hair and a set of lungs, Nan declared, exactly as determined as her mother's. Lillian named her for the mother she herself had lost young, and held her, that first afternoon, in the quiet of a house that finally, for the first time in 8 years, belonged entirely and only to the people who deserved to live in it. She looked down at her daughter's small, furious, newly opened eyes and thought, with a certainty that felt more solid than any ledger she had ever balanced, that whatever else the last 2 months had cost her, they had also taught her precisely the kind of mother she intended to be, one who never once let her child grow up believing love required disappearing quietly into someone else's version of the truth. Adelia Rourke, true to the promise Lillian had made her over 10 months before, left London quietly for a smaller life in the north, her name touched by scandal but not destroyed by it, a mercy Lillian had chosen to extend not for Adelia's sake alone, but because she had decided, somewhere in the long weeks of building her case, that she would rather be the kind of woman who ended cruelty than the kind who simply redirected it. Silas Hargrove did not leave Ashmoor House when the trial concluded. Lillian asked him, instead, to take up the position her father would have trusted him with years earlier if a jealous, dishonest man had not stood in the way of the chief steward of the reunified Merrick trading house, answerable to no one but herself. He accepted with the same quiet formality he had offered her that first afternoon at the solicitor's office near the docks, though there was, by then, a warmth beneath the formality that both of them had stopped pretending not to notice. Under his stewardship, the trading house recovered faster than even Lillian's own solicitors had predicted. He restored Thomas Bell to a senior clerkship in Bristol within the month, and made certain, quietly, that every honest man who had risked his position to help uncover the fraud was rewarded well beyond what caution alone would have required. He kept, too, the same habits that had made him invaluable to her father: the careful double-checking, the refusal to let any figure stand unverified, the plain conviction that a business built on honest ground would always outlast one built on charm. Lillian found, watching him settle into the role, that she trusted him with the fortune her father had spent a lifetime building more completely than she had ever trusted the man she had married for love, and understood, slowly, that the two kinds of trust had never been the same thing at all. It would be some months yet before either of them said aloud what had been growing steadily between them since the night he first laid a worn leather folio on a table and asked to be believed. Lillian was in no hurry. She had learned, at great cost, the difference between a love that demanded her trust immediately and a love willing to earn it slowly, in small honest increments, the way her father had once taught her to build a fortune patiently, and on ground solid enough to survive being looked at twice. When, on a quiet spring evening some months after Marguerite's birth, Silas finally took her hand across the small table in the room that had once held nothing but ledgers and evidence, and told her plainly, without a single rehearsed word to soften it, that he had loved her honesty long before he had ever let himself love anything more, Lillian found that she believed him instantly and completely, in a way she had never once, in 8 years, managed to believe her husband. On the first anniversary of the night everything had changed. Lillian stood on the front steps of Ashmoor House with Marguerite asleep against her shoulder, Nan close at her side, and Silas waiting a respectful distance away with the particular patient devotion of a man content to wait as long as she needed him to. The trading house her father built stood stronger that year than it ever had, not because a duke had lent it his name, but because the woman who actually ran it had finally stopped letting anyone convince her that running it quietly, and well, was worth less than being loved loudly and badly. There were mornings, still, when she caught herself bracing for a criticism that never came, some old reflex left over from 8 years of managing another person's moods before her own. She was learning, slowly, to notice those mornings and let them pass without giving them the weight they once demanded. She was learning, too, to let Marguerite grow up watching a mother who ran a trading house, argued figures with men twice her age without apology, and loved the people around her without needing to shrink herself to keep that love. It was, Lillian thought, watching her daughter's small hand close around one of her fingers on a quiet afternoon in the nursery, the truest inheritance she had left to give, not the fortune her father had built, though that mattered too, but the plain, hard-won knowledge that a woman's worth was never something another person could grant or take away, only something she could choose, every day, to remember for herself. She had entered her marriage believing love meant disappearing gracefully into someone else's life. She left it understanding that the truest kind of love, the kind worth keeping, never once asked her to disappear at all. If Lillian's story reminded you that patience, evidence, and quiet self-respect can outlast any amount of charm, that is exactly the lesson I hope you carry with you tonight. Subscribe to see how many more women like her find their way through this channel, and comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I would truly love to say hello and hear how far this story has traveled to reach you. Thank you for staying until the very end.